You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Jared Johnson, Executive Director of TransitMatters in Boston. Jared talks about making the case for the MBTA, the Orange Line shutdown, regional rail and electrification, overhead wires versus batteries, fair policy, and much, much more. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next. Jared Johnson, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So, Jared Johnson, I grew up in Oklahoma City, so not exactly the world's most transit-reliant city, but I actually did rely on the bus for a year when I was in my first year of high school. But in any case, grew up in Oklahoma City, worked in political campaigns for a while. Actually started first listening to the Overhead Wire when I was ironically driving up and down the freeway in Houston, Texas. Working on the 2014 governor's race. And after one more campaign, I finally decided to hang it up and to do something different. And so moved to Boston to do AmeriCorps in the community development space, which then led to doing community engagement work at a community development corporation or a nonprofit housing builder in Dorchester. And from that, I moved over to the real estate team there. And this whole time, since I'd moved to Boston, pretty much I'd been engaged with TransitMatters, first listening to the podcast and coming to some of the events, and then eventually joining the board. And so in 2019, we were able to get a grant and sort of, go from being just a small volunteer-only organization to now having staff. And since that time, we've grown, and now we're up to 6 people.
Wow. So what was the first thing that got you involved in transportation policy that you were like, oh my gosh, this is what I'm interested in doing? It could be when you're a kid, even you rode the train and you're like, this is awesome.
Oh, yeah. What was interesting is that really wasn't too much of the experience. I took my first train trip, I think when we were maybe 10 or 11. We took the Heartland Flyer just down to Gainesville, Texas. But no, I think it really crystallized my junior year of college. I went to a student government conference in D.C. The conference was forgettable, but we stayed in Bethesda, Maryland, which, for folks who don't know, it's about 8 or 9 miles outside of the downtown, the heart of DC. But I remember going there and just being amazed at the vibrancy in the street and buildings that most of them were taller than the buildings in Oklahoma City. And, I had just started paying attention to development in Oklahoma City because it was really going through a renaissance with the MBTA team and with all these major investments and our sales tax, and the private investment was finally kind of starting to build onto that public investment. So I was looking at these things through that lens already. And so when I got there, I was just like, why is this city, which is a sixth the size of Oklahoma City, why does their downtown feel more vibrant than ours in some places? And it started looking it up, and it was because of the metro, and it was because of this, transit-oriented development strategy. And so that's really kind of the lens that I come at it through, is less so about the trains, although I definitely have morphed into a train and bus geek. But to me, it really is about building those places that we love. I always think about how Americans, especially before the pandemic, spent billions of dollars to go to Florence, to go to Disney World, to go to New York City and Times Square, to go to these places that are walkable and vibrant and, where the car is de-emphasized. And it's like, we could have that everywhere if we just build the transit. And relax the zoning laws and a bunch of other things, but certainly the transit is a cornerstone.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk a little bit more about what you've been up to. It's been busy in Boston lately, it feels like.
Quite.
Even sitting in San Francisco, I'm like, wow, there's a lot going on in Boston.
For better or worse.
What are you all up to as transit advocates, and what's on the top of your mind right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that's on the top of our mind is really, making the case for the MBTA. The MBTA has had a rough, few years, but certainly this year, things have really come to a head with increased federal oversight of the T because of a number of safety issues. And, we stress to people that the T is safe and it's still, significantly safer than driving and all these other things. But that job is made a lot harder when people are jumping out of train windows because the vehicle is caught on fire. So we're having that conversation about, how do we help restore confidence in the agency? We're people that we criticize the T often and sometimes very harshly, and they deserve it. But there are so many people at the T, from the frontline workers to the people in the planning departments, who are really passionate and they're good people. And at the end of the day, no matter how much I criticize the system, that's what I rely on. I love the T and I love what it does for our city and our region. And so, I want to figure out how do we make that system stronger. But one of the key things that we're working on is how do we do that in a way that is equitable and respects that some people can't just work from home while we're fixing the system. And so those are the two biggest things. And, we're going to have a new governor in, a matter of days at this point in the November election. And so I think we're really focused on how do we keep transportation and particularly transit, how do we keep this a key issue for this incoming administration, and how do we get them to take some easy wins up front. And we've got some of those, low income fares, cutting commuter rail fares, some different things like that. How do we get them to take the small wins and keep engaged, but also to make the hard decisions and to find the funding to really address the safety issues, the maintenance issues. And, one of the things that people in agencies across the country are feeling, this operator crunch, which, I think is solvable, but it's going to take money and effort and attention.
Do people have an idea of, is there a strong favorite for the next governor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Democrat is leading by about 25 points, which people would be surprised. Massachusetts has only had one Democratic governor in the last 30 years. So
that was Deval Patrick.
Deval Patrick, yes. Who actually did really like transit and did some good things. Some things didn't get all the way finished. It's a question about whether or not ordering those cars from the Chinese railroad company was the best decision. But nonetheless, here we are.
In New York, the governor controls the MTA. Who's in charge of the T?
The governor.
The governor.
Yeah. We have the worst of all worlds. We have a regional transit system that only serves, half of the state. And it is the half of the state with 80% of the population and sizable amount of the GDP. But, you have elected officials in the other half of the state that are, understandably annoyed at having to fund the T. But yeah, so you have a regional system that is funded statewide, and the general manager is appointed by the MBTA board, which is then appointed by the governor.
Yeah. There's another election, a ballot measure coming up in Massachusetts as well. And it seems like if it passes, it might be good, the Fair Share Amendment. What's that, and what do you hope it could do if it does pass?
Yeah, so the Fair Share Amendment would be a marginal tax on millionaires. So it's been called the millionaire's tax. So I believe the first million is exempted, but if you have a $1.5 million home, then you will pay this increased tax on that 0.5. And so, I think, again, one of the things that people might be, surprised to learn about Massachusetts is that we don't have a graduated income tax. It's a flat tax, and there's been a number of referendums to try to change that, and they've all been not successful. But I think this one, by just sort of more narrowly targeting it, looks like it could be successful. So it'll add a pretty significant amount of money. The ballot measure is really focused on two key areas, education and transportation. And I think one of the things that we're having the conversation now about is what does transportation mean? What's the right funding allocation for both of those two priorities? And so, I think really trying to fight to get as much of that money for public transit in particular. That particular part of transportation is really going to be, I think, a key thing. And the other thing that's important to realize is that the voters can't actually obligate money. So, it will be binding that this tax will be added, but only the legislature can actually direct and sort of, lockbox funds. So that'll be another fun adventure next year, is when the legislation that codifies this referendum is created.
Could they just say, no, we're not going to do the will of the voters?
They could. I think it's highly unlikely. A number of them have endorsed it. So this one came onto the ballot, I believe. There's two ways. You can get a bunch of signatures but you can also have the legislature pass it, and it's got to be passed in 2 consecutive sessions. And so this was done that way. So, there's enough people in the State House who care about it. And I think it would be very politically unpalatable to just do a 180.
Another big issue recently was the Orange Line shutdown, and it got a lot of attention. And you all were paying really close attention to the aftermath as well. What did you see after the shutdown was announced to be over?
So we saw, continued slow zones on some of the slow zones that were identified before, which was to be expected. It takes a little while for them to run the trains fully loaded across newly laid track or newly ballasted track in order to settle things. But we noticed there were some new slow zones that had popped up that were not slow zones before the pandemic. And so we had that issue. And even after the week was done, some of the slow zones were lifted, but some of the existing slow zones that we knew about before the shutdown, those were not lifted. And these new sections had not been lifted. And so you had a situation where 3 weeks after the shutdown, the train was slower than it was before the shutdown. And so this was something that was really frustrating because, there was another way to do this work on the Orange Line that didn't involve inconveniencing 125,000 people. And so to do that and to not be honest about the work that was done or to not be able to deliver on the faster ride that was promised is kind of a slap in the face to the riders. So, but I think it really illustrates what I said at the beginning of this, which is that we have got to fix our system. And yes, there's going to be some tough work that has to come out of that. But the agency has to be transparent about what's happening. They have to back up the tough talk, and that something as extreme as a total shutdown should be the absolute last resort. And then you better stick the landing.
Exactly. Well, for folks that might not be familiar, though, why did they have to shut the Orange Line down in the first place? What was the years back reason that this all happened? I know that we could talk the whole time about this, but in a smaller kind of Cliff Notes-ish way.
I'm going to have to be very vague so I don't get in trouble here. I have my thoughts and my ideas about why they did it, but it was never actually clearly stated. The work needed to be done in terms of addressing the slow zones. That was very clear. Replacing some old rail.
Maintenance.
Addressing some track. Yeah, it's just long overdue maintenance. I think the real question is why did it need to be a month, and why announced only 3 weeks ahead of time? Why did it need to be a whole month of shutdown? I think that is the question that is really up in the air, and that we haven't really had a clear excuse. The FTA has said, "Don't look at us. We did not say that this was the way that they needed to do it." So the FTA is not the excuse here. I think one can look at polling data. One can look at a lot of coverage in the news about the T and draw your own conclusions about, PR and those sort of things.
Why would folks say that the FTA might have been the cause of something like this?
So one of the problems is that the FTA is an agency that only the most ardent of transit nerds know about, and even some of them probably don't know it. So
the Federal Transit Administration,
exactly right.
We're acronyming. We're even acronyming.
We're even using the acronyms. Absolutely. And so, there was a lot of misunderstanding about what the FTA was going to do. There were people who thought that the FTA was going to take the system over. I even thought that for a little bit, because there's some misconceptions about what happened in D.C., which is the only other time that the agency has done a closer federal audit and has taken over safety oversight for an agency. But people, misunderstood that taking over safety oversight to mean taking over the organization. And, one, that didn't happen. And two, the FTA already had a more extensive say in WMATA, the Washington Metro, the people who run Metrobus and run the DC Metro. They already had a greater authority in that because it's partly in the federal capital. So you had that issue. And then I also later on found out that some of the really extreme service cutbacks and the really aggressive maintenance schedule that also sidelined whole parts of their system, that was not the FTA either. That was, the former general manager who's now left. But I think that was why people sort of immediately thought, oh, well, okay, well, the FTA's here, they're taking over, they really shamed the T. This must have been their doing.
Huh. Tell me a little bit more about the transit tracker tool, because I think that there's been some really good reporting locally about the shutdown at the aftermath and how your organization has kind of helped bring a little bit of transparency.
Yeah, so we have a really, really incredible team of volunteers. We call them TM Labs, TransitMatters Labs team. And they've started creating some really incredible data visualizations. And I think they started about, a little over 2 years ago. And I think sort of the overall theme that we wanted to try to do, and it's really becoming apparent with the slow zone tracker, is, we wanted to provide data tools that could validate people's experience, right? Because, you'll be on the train and you'll think, gosh, this section is considerably slower than it was last week. But, without having access to the data, because you don't know how to do a API plugin, yada, yada. I don't even know how to do that.
Me neither.
And because it's not presented in a way that is readable, you don't have that. And so with the slow zone tracker, which, we launched it this summer, some folks started picking up on it, but it really came to the public consciousness during this Orange Line thing because it allowed people to screenshot and share on Twitter. Look at, like, my trip is taking this much longer, and I'm looking at these new slow zones that have popped up. What's going on? This isn't matching what the T is showing. And so that's just been really exciting to see these tools used and to see our use cases validated. Because sometimes people think that data or technology is the ends, and, I don't agree with that. I think it's the means, and I think this is a perfect example of that this isn't solving anything in and of itself, but it's illuminating things, and it's validating people's experience, and it's giving people, even Senator Markey, used the train tracker during a Senate hearing to ask, the general manager, what's up? Why is this time slower than it was before the shutdown when you said it was clearly not going to be?
Josh Fairchild, who's the TransitMatters president, was on the Monday show about a year ago, and we talked a little bit about plans to create a connected regional rail system and some electrification. I'm wondering where that's standing these days.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there hasn't been nearly as much official action, but one of the things that's been really incredible is that we and a number of our partners have continued to build support for it. And so it was something that was, a question that all of the lieutenant governor candidates were asked about. There was less of a race on the governor's side, but the gubernatorial candidate who's more favored to win has a extensive transportation section where she has highlighted that regional rail is one of her priorities. And so, I'm really hopeful that under this next administration that we can really move that project forward. But again, even if I'm a little disappointed that we haven't sort of moved it forward in a more concrete way, again, I'm really excited that people are realizing just like what this is going to mean for gateway cities, which in Massachusetts, we've got a unique sort of political and population geography where at the ends of some of our commuter rail lines, we have sizable cities, post-industrial cities with a sizable low-income and minority population. And so having cheap, fast, bi-directional rail service is really going to be, I think, a boon to those communities. And like I said, we've just continued to gather a broad range of support from folks in the housing world who recognize, particularly because Massachusetts just passed a new law that mandates every community that has a commuter rail stop zone for multifamily housing as of right. They're really interested in this conversation about increasing commuter rail service and eventually regional rail service to these places. The folks in the workforce development community who understand the potential for jobs for this. And so, yeah, like I said, I'm really happy that it has stayed on the table. I actually had a panel on this earlier in Revolution that now coming up on 4+ years afterwards, it's still talked about and people are really excited for it.
What about the electrification process in terms of, I think the regional rail also depends on the connection between North and South Station. And then there's also the electrification, which I think the governor got involved in some form or fashion recently as well.
Yeah.
What's going on with that?
Yeah. So we, the North-South rail connection is definitely an important part. We think the electrification kind of part has to come first because of, one, political will, but also just the geometry issues and things in the tunnel. But yeah, the electrification piece this has been a weird sort of sticking piece. To be fair, electrification in the U.S. has, because we do it so infrequently, has been a fraught process. You're no stranger to the troubles that have happened, in the Bay Area with the Caltrain electrification process. I think in 5 years, when those electric trains are running on there, all of this will be a distant memory and no one will care. It's one of the richest regions of the entire globe. But we're in the beginning stages, and so everyone's just looking at the cost and not thinking about the benefits. And so the T has been looking at battery technology, and we take a little bit of a dim view on that in the short term. I think there's exciting possibilities for the future, but I think no one would look at the MBTA, the current state of it, or the new trains that we got from a Chinese company that's never built trains in America before. No one would look at that situation and say, yeah, the T ought to be the first people in the world to try to use electric trains to come every 15 minutes. So So you've got that. And then we were really confused by the fact that, that's what the T has said in their PowerPoints. But then the governor, like as you said, intervened in a recent policy bill to remove the restriction on the T from buying new diesel locomotives past 2030, and then also contradicted the vehicle type that the T is putting out in their own report. So, I think we get a lot of mixed messages from this administration on electrification. So I'm really hopeful that the next administration will take advantage of the fact that on one of our commuter rail lines, I think the most utilized one, in fact, it is 98% electrified. That's the Northeast Corridor. It actually contains some of the only high-speed track in the country. But yeah, I'm hopeful that they'll build on that and that they'll work on the Fairmount line, which is a commuter rail line that goes right through the middle of the city, of kind of a subway desert where the subway skirts the black and brown neighborhoods in Boston. And that also on the North Shore between Boston and Lynn and Salem and Beverly, 3 large cities, for the Massachusetts context outside of Boston, that have also been, asking for more service. And 2 of them are gateway cities as well. So I'm hopeful that we'll start to make some progress on the actual electrification piece in this next administration.
Did you get a chance to read, you mentioned the Fairmount line and just brought this into my mind. There was a book by Jeremy Levine, Constructing Community.
Yeah.
Did you get a chance to read that? He did some stuff his book was about the Fairmount line and the community development along it.
Right. And I haven't had a chance to read the book, but I've read, I believe that book came out of some academic work that he had been doing and all that. And so I've read some of the academic work and then actually worked at one of the CDCs that is along the Fairmount line. That was that CDC in Dorchester, the Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation.
Yeah, I had him on the show, and it was just fascinating to talk. It's not just a Boston story. It's kind of like a microcosm of community development, it feels like, around the country, and who represents who, and
Absolutely.
What creates community, and what community actually means, and who represents who. And it was just really fascinating. And the Fairmount line, because of that, just sparked my interest.
Well, and one of the things that we're hopeful for is that when this transformation happens, that it will encourage other commuter rail networks. There are a lot of commuter rail systems around the country that have some of those same characteristics. They pass by low-income and minority neighborhoods and don't stop there because, the whole idea of commuter rails get the folks from the wealthier, often whiter suburbs into town quicker. Well, with electrification, particularly if you do it with, electric multiple units and the kind of subway-style trains, that stop penalty isn't as much of a big deal. And B, it's the right thing to do to provide service for these communities. And then lastly, it's also the smart thing to do because we have no clue what the future of commuter rail is. I was looking at some data from APTA, and commuter rail nationwide is around about 50-something% of its pre-COVID ridership, which lags behind bus by about 20 points and other modes, I'm assuming that is subway and other things, by about 10 points. And so, if you want to build a more sustainable model for the future, it's going to include closer in urban communities where there's either no rail lines or a really infrequent bus or long bus commutes. And so, yes, I'm hopeful that the Fairmount line will be a great example of that.
A more metro style system for the center cities and the Philadelphias and the Chicagos, etc.
Absolutely.
Seems really interesting. I want to go back to electrification for a bit because the T has also been frustrating to me from like an electric bus standpoint, and the removal of overhead wires and the move towards electric buses with the diesel bus in the middle. I'm wondering, and I don't want to just
harp on the T,
nag on the T, because I think this is a national thing.
Yeah.
And I asked Sarah Kaufman about this earlier today, actually. Why are we so focused on getting rid of our overhead wires that work so well and trying to push a battery technology that's not quite ready for prime time? I feel like there are really good options. I mean, Shenzhen in China has a fully electric bus network, and they're doing really well, but they're on their second set of buses. They had a lot to learn from the first set. We're just kind of getting started with stuff. And so I'm wondering what we have to fear about overhead wires, about alternative forms of electrification that came like 100 years ago. Just we're so fascinated with getting the battery on board.
Yeah. I think it can seem like the easier option, right? And to be fair to agencies, in some cases, when you're an agency that has, had to have a knockdown, drag out fight with the community about, I don't know, something as simple as a covered bus stop or something like that, it feels like, the idea of putting up new wire, let alone addressing people that have concerns or have issues or aesthetic things with the existing wire, that can feel like a lot. And so I think for a lot of these agencies, it feels like, there's barely the institutional sort of backing to electrify. This other stuff is really pushing the boundaries. But, I can't lie, it can be frustrating. And, I think these next few years will be really interesting to see, whether it's the issues that Connecticut has been having with some of their fleet. I think the thing that agencies have going for them is that virtually all of the North American market is all in on it. And so, I'm hopeful. I think, if I had a magic wand, would have done the MBTA process differently. But now that this is the path they've taken, I have no choice but to root for this to be successful. But yeah, the resistant overhead wire can be quite frustrating. And I think, especially so on commuter rail or rail rights of way, where with the exception of a few grade crossings, it's not going through cities or over streets in that same way. So that's one where I think we are a bit more willing to sort of take on the T on that one.
You guys are also working on fare policy as well. What are some of the changes that you would like the T to make in terms of fare policy?
Yeah, well, the number one thing, it would be a low-income fare. We're really glad to support our partners, groups like Green Routes and ACE and Livable Streets and the Public Transit Public Good Coalition in really getting the T to do a low-income fare. They're one of the few agencies of their size that doesn't have that program. They do have programs for seniors and for youth, but for folks in their, late teen years to early 20s on up until 65, they're not covered by that program. And, it may not seem like a lot, but for some people at the margins, $2.40 or for close to $5 can be a lot. And especially if you maybe didn't have the money at the beginning of the day or the beginning of the week to buy a pass, then getting dinged that over and over again is an issue. And then, that's just for people in the core. Again, as I mentioned earlier with the gateway cities, we have a significant amount of low-income folks who live, in Worcester, 30-something miles away from Boston, which if you take the commuter rail is, I believe, close to $12 each way. That's just not, I would be a little bit annoyed by paying, $24 a day, $22 with a pass discount. So we want to see that low-income fare happen, and we want to see it applied to all modes. We also would love to see just a cheaper overall commuter rail system. Going back to that Worcester example, it is ridiculous to me that it is cheaper to drive on the turnpike to Worcester, the Mass Pike, than it is to take a train. And someone can get into a pedantic argument with me about taxes and insurance, and I would just say, who gives a blank? People aren't thinking about, what is it? Insurance is 2 months time. No one's thinking about what's 1/60th of my policy every time they get in the car. No, it is cheaper to drive to a lot of these cities. And I picked the one with the toll. So for the other roads that don't have tolls, it's significantly cheaper. So yeah, we want a much cheaper commuter rail system. We also want a system that's way simpler. The T has 2 fare charts for its commuter rail, one for regular trips and then one for interzone trips if you're not going all the way into Boston. That is outrageous. It's really funny for, some of the folks, especially in this administration, who have the we ought to run government like a business mindset. You don't go into McDonald's and have a 12-step process to order a Big Mac. Why is it so damn complicated to ride commuter rail?
I'm going to agree with that. We make it harder than it really needs to be.
Absolutely.
I noticed this coming from the airport here in Miami, actually. You take the little people mover to the station where you get on the orange line, and you get on the orange line to the Metro mover. And the orange line just, it wasn't too difficult. And I already actually had a card from a previous conference I'd come to here. But the card reader was kind of broken, and I was worried that I was going to miss the train. And if I missed the train, it's like every 30 minutes. And I was freaking out. And I'm a regular user, right? I'm like somebody who should know really well the system. And it's like, why can't we just have this standard thing that everybody is okay with? And there's all these little details in every single place that are a little bit different. And we have this problem, as you know, in the Bay Area. We have 20 plus transit agencies. So, we're trying to make it all kind of condensed and simplified, but it's really a difficult process.
Yeah, and I think going back to that whole theme about, treating government like a business, or a lot of agencies have started to call their riders customers. If you're going to do that framework, that should extend to making your system super, super easy to use. One of the trends that is, I don't know, maybe I'm being iconoclastic, some folks might be mad, but the trend of doing away with station attendants to just do everything on a ticket machine, maybe that's not the world of the future, particularly when we think about the much thornier question where I see some of the benefits of train automation, things like that. I think we're ways off from that, but I agree with you that transit ought to be the easiest option in the world. Transit agencies should be going out of their way to lower those barriers, whether it's, the amount of the fares, how you get them, all of those things. And, they need help with that. A lot of times these agencies that are severely underfunded. But I think we absolutely need to push these agencies. If you're going to call your riders customers, then you need to do right by them. I think it's one of the things that we brought up sometimes with the T on, the way that they will treat their customers after service disruptions and after major sort of failures. It's like, well, if this was a private business, you'd be emailing a we're sorry and, your next dinner is on us kind of thing. And so, that's what we should be doing.
Yeah. There's also the fare free trials have been going on as well.
Yeah.
How's that been received?
I mean, it's been received very, very well. I think the fare free pilots have been going really well in Boston. So there's 3 routes that have been made fare free. These are 3 of the busiest routes that go through the heart of Boston's Black and brown community. And they saw a 38% increase in ridership and faster boarding times. Some of the ridership did come from people who would have just walked on their trips. I think a smaller percentage has come from car trips, but I think for a short pilot that's only been going on for, I think we're coming up on a year, but that's only been going on for a year, and with all things held constant, tons of free parking and other issues, I think it's still really, really encouraging to see that. And also, some of the folks who are walking, Boston's winter gets pretty cold and our summer gets pretty hot. So, if someone hopped on the bus for a free ride for something that they would have walked before, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, that's what public transit is for. So, I'm excited to see this happen. And one of the things that is really exciting is actually outside of the T, our regional transit authorities, which are our smaller bus agencies that run service outside of the core of Boston. Some of them have been fare free since COVID, including the Worcester Regional Transit Authority. And, in some of the cases with the regional transit authorities, a lot of them provide kind of lifeline service. And so there are some cases where it actually, a pretty significant amount of their revenue is eaten up by the cost of collecting fares. And so, I think there's a really strong argument with the RTAs to have them go fare free.
Yeah, it's an argument that's happening all over the country. And there's obviously a lot of folks on numerous different sides, not even just for and against, but the efficacy and all that stuff. So it's interesting to see some trials actually happening in a big city like Boston.
Yeah, and I think our organization, doesn't have like a firm opinion on it because we've got strong voices on either side. But I think the thing that we all agree on, even the fare free advocates, my friend Stacey Thompson would agree, like, it doesn't have to be an either or thing of more service or free fares. We know who benefits from better transit and cheaper transit. We know that transit has to be a key part of our decarbonization and our climate change fight. And so, why don't we make the case to lower barriers and, figure out what that phased process is. But how do we lower those fare barriers for the most impacted people first? But how do we lower those barriers overall? And how do we increase and expand access?
Yeah. So we're at a year anniversary of the infrastructure bill. Have you seen any kind of action locally, or is it something that is going to take years to see the impacts?
I think it's going to take years to see the impact, but I think some of the programs that have been set up are really positive. Like, the reconnecting communities. A lot of folks were, I was disappointed when, Build Back Better kind of fell apart and when, it looked like that piece was going to be lost. And so even though, wished there could have been a bit more money, it's still really incredible. I mean, this is the first time that the federal government has really, really acknowledged, or not only acknowledged its role in devastating communities with the Interstate Highway Act, but also, has put money on the table to try to address some of those solutions. So I think things like that, more money for rail car procurement and more money for buses. I believe one of the changes this year was setting aside more money for facilities with the bus side as well, because they've set aside money for low and no emission buses for some time, but I think there's been restrictions on, that it has to go towards fleet. And for a lot of agencies, the T in particular, the facilities are a major pinch point to that zero emission transformation. So it's very early, but, I think having Secretary Pete, him and some of the folks that he's brought in on his team has been really transformative.
That's a really interesting point about the facilities, because I think people just think that buses go onto the road and that's about it. There's a whole maintenance issue with electric vehicles versus diesel buses and the parts and all that stuff.
The power.
The power.
You have to bring in
where the charging comes from.
An extreme amount of power into the building. You have to figure out, are you going to have an overhead gantry system that can move a plug around, or are you going to have plugs for all 80 of your buses? In Boston, some of our bus garages are trolley barns. They're old trolley barns, or they're made for buses from whatever. And so there's some of our garages that modern buses can't even fit into the bay. So these are some of the issues that you talk about when it comes to bus electrification.
Yeah. Last question. You all have been really successful at changing the conversation in Boston, or at least elevating certain conversations. I wonder if you have any advice for advocates in other places that would like to, have similar impact in their communities.
Gosh, that's such a good question. Yeah, what is the TransitMatters secret sauce?
Is it just being like a bunch of nerds like us?
I do think in a lot of cities, the news media, riders, elected officials are really looking for knowledgeable, passionate people who don't work at the transit agency to help them understand things. And there are people inside of the transit agency who want people on the outside to help, support them when they make tough decisions, or kind of help push them if there's decisions happening that leadership is doing that they don't agree with. So, leaning into that nerdy side. But no, I do think figuring out what your niche is and running with that, figuring out what new thing, or maybe what thing that has been talked about in the past has been dropped. What are you going to add to the conversation? I think one of the things that we struggled with for a little bit is figuring out what were we going to be. Were we going to be a grassroots group? And we looked around and said, okay, well, we're a little bit Cambridge, Somerville, north of the river centric. We've expanded since then.
Yeah.
And we're a little dude heavy. We weren't as diverse as we, could have been, and we've made some good strides in all those areas. But we said it's just not going to be credible for us to be a grassroots group in Lynn, 8 miles from Boston, and be one in Worcester, 35 miles from Boston, and be one in Boston's Latino neighborhoods and cities to the north, and also in the Black neighborhoods to the south. And there are other organizations doing that stuff. And so we have found our niche partnering with grassroots groups and trying to figure out how we can support them with our data and our wonky tools. And so we've really just leaned into who we are and really found our niche in that. And then, regional rail has been one of those transformative things that we introduced into the conversation. Not that we came up with the concept, but, really the ones pushing it and bringing it into the Boston conversation, I think has really been transformative. So I think it's those couple of things, find your niche, figure out how you can add to the conversation. Because again, I think in just about every city, certainly in cities where there's not an established advocacy network, there's that need. And then you've got to figure out what kind of group you're going to be and what solutions. I really love Transit Center for their reports and for the ways that they gather advocates together to share stories and to share campaigns that other groups are doing. Some folks, one of the groups I always love shouting out is the MARTA Army, that went around adopting bus shelters to shovel them out or to give them amenities. There's just so many ways that you can figure out what your niche is. Yeah.
Well, if folks want to find out more information about TransitMatters or want to follow you on Twitter or whatever, how can folks do that?
Yeah, so folks can follow us on Twitter at TransitMatters. They can also follow us on Instagram at that handle. We've got some amazing Instagram content these days. And then you can find me at JARJOH for transit takes, lefty politics, and YIMBYism.
Awesome. Well, Jared, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Big fan of the show. This was part of my Urban Pill experience.
Thanks. And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.